It all happened in central Italy, in Lazio, the region where Rome is, and I need to give some context about it. The area around Rome is full of hills, most of that region is, and underneath many of these hills sit ancient Roman pre-Christian catacombs. So many, in fact, that they're not even that big of a deal for the locals, and some of these catacombs even got converted into wine cellars or basements over the centuries, but some haven't. This is important for later. Now, these two girls, which we'll call E and C, were in their early 20s, had been together for a year or so back then, and given how ludicrously expensive rents in Rome are, decided to try their luck finding a flat in one of the small towns around that area, on those hills I've mentioned. Mind you, those hills aren't ominous at all. If you've ever seen pictures from Tuscany, that's what they look like, which is rather lovely. And they did find a small apartment for rent in one of those towns, a renovated flat on the second floor of a much older house, which isn't surprising at all in that region, as many houses are centuries old and just get renovated from time to time. On the ground floor of that apartment there were some neighbors, but they never got to see too much of them, a couple of apartments with old people living in them. There was also a very old, sturdy wooden door, which was always closed and locked by a padlock, and when they asked the landlord where it led, he told them it was the door to some old cellar nobody really used anymore, and supposedly was connected to one of the catacombs I've mentioned earlier. Again, it's an ancient country, and such things don't come across as particularly weird to us. Neither it did to E and C, who just shrugged it off like, okay, makes sense. So, E and C spent a few months in that town, not really bonding with anyone, mainly commuting from there to Rome and back to work and study. However, being a homosexual couple in an old town full of old and bigoted people, they quickly started noticing how unwelcome they really were there. They'd go to the local store to buy food and the clerk would ignore them on purpose. They'd find their mailbox emptied and all of their mail scattered over the floor outside their apartment. They'd even bump into people riding scooters around town, passing them by and yelling, "Goddamn lesbians." In short, they didn't have the best time there, but they knew it was only a temporary solution, so they decided to just endure it all while waiting to move again. Then, one morning, as she was stepping outside to go to the car and drive to Rome, E found something on the ground right in front of their flat's door. A mussel shell had been placed there, with a doused red candle in it. And judging by the mess it made and how short the candle was by now, it had been burning for the whole night. Not knowing what to do with it, she picked up the shell with the candle and threw it in the garbage, together with all the wax she could scoop up from the floor. Another thing she noticed, when she finally set out to leave, was that door, the sturdy wooden door downstairs that had always been closed up to that point, wasn't locked anymore. The padlock was gone, and it was opened just by a crack. But she didn't really pay much attention to it right then. But then things started happening. At first it was an uneasy feeling. E and C would be in their living room, sitting on the couch, reading, chatting, watching a movie, and suddenly they'd have this feeling like someone was watching them. Later on it became more than that. They'd hear noises around the house, like someone knocking on the walls in another room, or the toilet flushing on its own, water taps turning on by themselves in the kitchen. Quickly it became less than bearable. One night, as they were sleeping, they both woke up in the middle of the night hearing the footsteps of bare feet in their living room. They started listening. It felt like the footsteps were simply pacing around, and there was nothing else, no voices, no items being moved, just the sound of bare feet in their living room. After a while C, feeling understandably scared, whispered, "What's that?" to E, and as she did the footsteps stopped, as if noticing her voice in the silence of the apartment. They stopped, and a split second later they started sprinting towards their bedroom. E grabbed C and turned her face away from the door, doing so herself, just moments before the footsteps came through their bedroom's door and stopped to the side of the bed. "Don't look, whatever happens now, don't look," E told C, and held her in her arms for the rest of the night, neither of them sleeping, just listening in for those footsteps to finally leave, or whoever it was to do something, anything at all. But nothing happened. They spent the next 3 hours wide awake, in silence, until dawn came, and with that bit of sunlight finally shining through, E found the courage to turn around, and nothing was there. Another night E, who was in university at the time, was up late studying in their living room as C was sleeping. Like I said before, it was summer, and the window in the living room was open. She wasn't facing it. The window was to her left as she was sitting at the table taking notes. Suddenly, she felt the hair at the back of her head stand, and had that familiar feeling of being watched, so she instinctively turned to the window. She described what she saw as a completely pitch-black human-like figure, perched on the windowsill, with no features on its face save for two very large orange glowing eyes, who just stood there motionless and stared at me. She couldn't tell me for how long she stared at it. She told me she felt completely paralyzed and helpless, and had the feeling that, had she tried to move or do anything, that thing would have lunged at her. Eventually, she couldn't hold it anymore, turned around and closed her eyes, took a long deep breath, and looked again, and it was gone. After that, they contacted their landlord and decided to leave for good. They did so within a week since that event. The last thing E noticed, as they were finishing packing their things up and leaving, was that big wooden door, the one who had been left open ever since all of those events had begun, was now once again closed and locked shut with a padlock.